Before we start into a very special episode of the Innovation Show X, I want to thank our sponsor Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. I also want to thank the team at Thinkers 50 for allowing me the time to record at this year's event, the gala dinner in London at the Guildhall with this magnificent lineup. I won't give you any more. Over to that episode now. AI is shaping business, but most companies are chasing tools rather than restructuring the businesses and the business models underlying those businesses. The picture is confusing. 95%, according to MIT, of Gen AI projects fail or underdeliver on their projected value, if they add any value at all. Tech giants and consulting arms are letting go of swathes of people only to rehire them weeks or months later. The picture is confusing. The puzzle is incomplete. So we have to look at what is underlying these businesses. It reminds me of Amara's law. Amara's law is a technological law where we overestimate the value of a technology in the short run, but undervalue the extent of that change in the long run. But Amara's law applies not only to the technology, but the business impact of that technology. It is a puzzle, it's a paradox, and here at Thinkers 50 in London, 2025, in a magnificent episode of Innovation X, I'm joined by three of the world's best thinkers on this to unpack different lenses to look at this puzzle. We're joined over here by Alex Osterwalder.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you in person on the show. Howard Yu, welcome back, sir.
What a great treat.
Great to have you. And Sangeet Choudary as well. Two guests previously on the Innovation Show X, joined by Alex now. We promised you extra value. We've given you the best possible value you can have. So let's get stuck in. Sangeet, I thought I'd come to you first.
Sure.
One of the things you talk about in Reshuffle is this idea of containerisation. I love it as an analogy of what we're seeing with the reshuffle that AI does to business landscape. Let's share with the audience a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the idea of containerization is interesting. I start the book Reshuffle with the 4 words, why unintelligent AI matters. And the reason I say that is because today, our dominant metaphor for looking at AI is intelligence. We're constantly debating, do we have a 5th grader or a PhD in our pocket? And which kinds of exams and benchmarks can it work towards? And the other metaphor we have is of automation, making things faster, cheaper, better. But all of these assume that the impact of AI will play out within fixed structures, whether it's organizational structures, industry boundaries, business models, nothing's going to change. It's just going to be automation. The reason I chose containerization to make my point is that the shipping container is the polar extreme of AI. It is not an intelligent technology. It's a dumb, simple box. And if you had thought of the shipping container as a technology and its effects, your first order thinking would have led you to believe that the effects of the shipping container would be automation. And it did automate the ports because before the shipping container, cargo used to be break bulk. And so you needed manual labor to move cargo on and off ships. With the shipping container, you standardized that interface and hence you could now have cranes. But if you had just stopped at the impact of the shipping container and read it as automation, you would have missed out on everything that unfolded beyond that. Because what really dramatically changed things with the shipping container was when trucks, trains, and ships agreed on a common standard for the shipping container. The reason that was important was now you could move from source to destination, independent of whether you were landlocked or at a port, with the same reliability. And reliability has incredible value in a world where business boundaries are determined by what we call transaction costs. And because shipping became reliable, the whole logic of manufacturing changed. Because before that, you wanted to keep things in-house as a manufacturer, or you wanted to keep your suppliers close by because shipping was unreliable. As a retailer, you wanted to rely on distributors because they would keep the stocks to manage unreliability. The moment shipping became reliable, manufacturing got unbundled. We started seeing the rise of global supply chains. We started, most importantly, seeing component-level competition, because now you did not need to build everything in-house. So companies could specialize, plug into a global supply chain, and compete at the level of components. And once components improved, the larger product innovation happened with improving components. And that's what gave us the computer industry and many other things. So my key point with all of this is the impact of AI will play out not through making things faster, better, cheaper, automating, agentic. All of that is a distraction. The real point is think of these second and third order effects and see the reshuffling of the system.
One of the things I took from your analogy was the people would have invested in cranes or they would have invested in the technology to move the shipping containers, much like we see with AI.
Right.
And also, it's a nice segue for Alex, because I thought of the moving of these containers, much like your business model canvas, and actually how that helped for many of us, me included, with the shift from, say, media, where I worked, the shift from analog to digital meant that it wasn't just a layering of digital on top, although that's how it started. Most companies, for example, a newspaper just had a brochure that sat on a website and it didn't move, it didn't have any interaction. But to your point about the underlying model and unbundling it, it meant a total restructure of the entire organization, about the skill sets, and we'll come to you, Howard, about this, the capabilities needed for that organization, but most importantly, to the business model underlying it. And that doesn't always spell new value. It can actually unbundle value in a negative sense as well. I'd love you to give your view. You did a webinar recently about this, about the effect of AI on business models. And I thought bringing you gents together was a superpower to give people a true lens of what's going on.
Yeah. And I love the analogy, looking at how the environment is changing and everything that needs to happen. I'll kind of zoom into one company, one business model, but I'll use an analogy as well. And Steve Blank actually came up with this, the inventor of the customer development lean startup methodology. And we were talking about this summer. He's saying, Alex, do you know in the 1900s, there were 4,000 wagon manufacturers? And yes, well, do you know how many actually became car companies? And the answer is, like, a lot of people say, oh, zero. Well, there was one. Studebaker is a brand that made it from, wagon manufacturer to become a car manufacturer. And then you can stretch it a little bit and say Billy Durant, he sold all of his wagon, manufacturing assets and then started a car company, and then later on GM. But the point is, if you look at what happened there's a technology component. But the big lesson to take away is there was a lack of vision and leadership to actually use this in new ways and make things happen. Right? So one is the environment has to change. You need leaders there who see, okay, well, AI is now here. What could I do to support that ecosystem? But the big one is leadership within companies.
Yeah.
So entrepreneurs are pretty good at that. And then, one out of 100 will maybe succeed big. But when we look at large established companies, many of them are going to disappear because they do not have that visionary entrepreneurial leadership. You always have to run the company you're running at the same time you transform. So all that to say, AI, at the end of the day, is just a technology. It's a very powerful one, enables a lot of things, but without the visionary leadership and then the drive to implement that and the right systems in place to allow people in a company with drive and who want to try things to let them thrive, is not going to happen, right? So we're going to see a lot of change, the macro aspect of how the economy is going to work, but also a lot of companies are going to disappear. And I'm not one to often say that, but it's just inevitable because the leadership we see in many companies today, the establishment, is not an entrepreneurial leadership. It's a very managerial leadership. And that managerial leadership is not equipped for massive change, to be honest.
The capabilities of those leaders often aren't trained. So we'll talk later on. You expand on the work with James March, Tushman O'Reilly, the idea of exploit, explore, and how many leaders are exploiters of the business model they've uncovered. And they don't have the capability to explore, nor do they take the time to build up those capabilities. And Howard, I was very fortunate. I'm always struck by the serendipity of doing the innovation show. I'm currently reading a book by Charles House. He's the gentleman who led to computer screens, etc. Earlier prototype in HP. You've studied in depth HP. And one of the things he did was he talks about how when there was a shift to transistors from vacuum tubes, many of the people he studied with, engineers, were gone overnight. And it wasn't a case of doing a night course to try and build out capability. It was simply gone because it meant more than a new skill. It was a shift in mindset of how you actually dealt with that new skill. And it made me think exactly of your work, because you're looking always at the capabilities needed for seismic shifts like AI will bring.
Mm-hmm. And what Alex as well as Sangeet just described there, I never made that connection before. But essentially, it calls for almost like an architectural innovation, but at the industry level. Yeah. So Rebecca Henderson and Kim Clark would study architectural innovation inside a firm. But what you both just described is the architectural innovation happening at the ecosystem or at the industry level. So let's assume a company already have the vision. Let's imagine we are wealthy enough to bring a group of CEO to Silicon Valley, to Shenzhen, and look across the world. They have the time and they immerse themselves and come back with a vision. Let's assume vision is there. I suspect company can get it right. They need one more thing. They need to know exactly how things work today in order to map out how things should work in the future. So who knows what? How things getting work done? Because so many companies we work with, they don't even know how it works. Take a pharmaceutical company, anybody, right? Even generic drugs or, biopharma. If you ask for 5 levels down, no one knows how things work. And without knowing who knows what, exactly how things work at a master plan level, first is you cannot reimagine the future, because if you change one thing, you worry the whole things would have a meltdown, catastrophic consequence. Or you cannot even leverage AI to give you some new way of working to eliminate what should not exist from day one. So I could really see there are two sides of the companies. One is having a vision and also the prerequisite knowledge about how we are working right now so that they could reimagine the future for this architectural innovation at the industry level. Hard. This is why I think only a handful can make through that way. But hey, look, it's always the winner takes all, right? When you face seismic shift.
One of the things that came up at Thinkers 50 was, say, for example, an organization doesn't know where to bet. You talk about, for example, an organization should only have 3 priorities. Any more than that, they don't have any priorities. Yeah. But where to play as well is very difficult. And things like the Metaverse didn't help us, where organizations were putting bets in there, maybe investing in it, trying to build capabilities there, and it didn't play out. Yeah. So that's been known as FOMO, fear of missing out.
Right.
But one of the things that it brought to mind was, how do you know where to build the capabilities for the future if you don't know where the future is going to be?
So I would just give a very short answer, then, Alex and Sangeet, please build on. But I think there is almost like conservative company having this like simplistic view. Transformation is after deep analysis, one big gamble, and it plays out. That wrong.
Doesn't work in.
That wrong, damn it. Because Steve Jobs almost shut down iPhone 3 times before he launched it. The famous Alexa project by Amazon was born out from the collapse of the Fire phone. So capability is different than product offering. But of course, once you learn you fail, now this is hard. You need to keep the engineers, not firing them, do real postmortem, capture the knowledge, show it, use it, and recycle it. Most companies just don't have that emotional resilience to have those type of conversation, let alone show it across. So yeah, I think capability is very different than the product offering itself. You're looking at Meta, right? Yeah, Metaverse is like crazy, but there are capabilities they build around hardware, which you see expressed in Ray-Ban. We don't know how things would unfold, but if you don't keep on stacking up, where would you have the future? If we keep on polishing our historic competence, we all end up like Kodak, Polaroid, and Blockbuster.
So FOMO, fear of missing out. I was thinking about this recently. I was like, there's also another FOMO type phenomenon. I call it FOTO, FOTO, fear of throwing out. And by that I mean, you've built a tech stack. The tech stack has been a massive investment by an organization. Then the CEO or the C-suite, to Alex's point, don't really understand what that does. They're relying on somebody in the organization who may not actually know what the next move is, and certainly not, to your point, to reshuffle that entire stack, which totally takes an unbundling of the architecture you have. And there's a law called Conway's law, which is that the architecture, the organizational structure will actually be matched in the architecture of technology. Yeah. There's a lot in there, but this is a huge problem when you come to a new technology like AI.
Absolutely. Let me just say one thing. This is such an interesting conversation because Howard's view is inside out. What's the capability stack? My view is outside and what's the playing field? And I feel, and I don't want to oversimplify, but I feel Alex bridges the two things really well. And
yes, he really does.
Right. So I'll just complement what Howard just said to answer that question. One way is to really think of how is your capability stack matching what's required? But the other question is where to play. What is required? There are two factors that determine what is required. And those two factors basically answer a simple question. Where is value moving? And how can we play where that value is moving? So there are there are many different factors that come together, but two that really come to mind as being very important on determining where value is moving and how the playing field is changing. The first is this idea of complementarity. So we say industry boundaries are dissolving and are becoming porous, but really what all of that means is that previously siloed, unconnected industries are now complementary. One of the primary drivers for complementarity was data. So you could capture data from a car and move it into the insurance industry and connect the two together. Now we have AI. You can now take non-standardizable information, messy knowledge, which used to be very industry specific, and somehow feed it into models and make the two industries complementary and allow capabilities to be packaged in one and moved into the other. And I think that's super powerful in terms of changing your playing field. The second factor that determines how value moves is commoditization, because technology constantly commoditizes capabilities that held value in the past. So take AI as an example. A lot of companies in the knowledge economy were built on a simple assumption that knowledge is scarce and you need to go to Harvard, you need to be trained, and even once we hire you, we have to keep investing in training you. Now, if some forms of knowledge would become commoditized and become available with a well-structured prompt, value is not going to sit there, it's going to move somewhere else. And so really, the way I see this whole thing is you need to look at matching your architecture to the technology, because the architecture of your playing field is getting matched to the technology anyway. And so in order to play successfully over there, you have to follow what's the architecture of the new technology. And the way to do that is to keep an eye on what are the new complementarities, what's getting commoditized, where is value moving, and how can I then move my capability stack in response to that.
One of the big fears, though, on that is actually what Alex talks about, is that if you have a skill set and you've built a business based on the stack as it was for that time in history that was needed for, so you had a competitive advantage, then you're exploiting. Yeah. But the fear of exploring and then harmed in some way by history, where like the Metaverse, those type of things, that I tried something and they kept receipts on me in the organization, so they're not letting me away with it, and I have that blemish on my record. Yeah. There's a huge fear about that, Alex, and I know you work with some magnificent companies at leadership level to redirect the ship in entirely new directions.
I'm actually thinking, because you're talking about the different laws, and since you know everything that goes on in innovation, you read every single book that ever existed on innovation.
No, you have.
I'll ask you if that law exists, otherwise we're going to have to invent it with this group. It's actually the law of the existing business model spewing out corporate antibodies that kills anything that looks differently. Because once you've found a business model that works, actually what happens is the company is really good at doing just that. And there are very few companies that are able to either reinvent themselves or create a portfolio of business models. Extremely rare. And the leaders I work with, they don't understand the force of their existing business model. It will kill anything that looks differently, from the radically different business model to maybe just a new value proposition that has slightly different margins, because the sales team is not going to want to sell that because they're not going to get their bonus. So the existing business model, there's a law of the existing business model killing anything that looks differently. And the best companies, and there are few of them, they are paranoid of disappearing. So they create a fertile ground where people can explore. And there'll be tons of failures, but the winners will emerge. And I think with a technology as powerful as AI, you just don't know what's going to work. So you have to explore. But when your existing business model continues to kill everything that, you're trying, it's not going to work, right? So a lot of companies, you have innovators. They find something that works because you don't lack ideas. You don't lack, the people who could build it. But then the system, the business model, like how you run your company, will kill anything unless the leadership has a very clear vision where we're going and is going to help support some of those that look like winners, invest more, scale them. Because most ideas, they die in the scaling phase.
Yeah.
Companies have amazing ideas. Now, the wrong part, just quickly back to the exploit. What companies do often very wrong is they want to win big, so they invest in one big idea. So the corporate antibodies won't kill it because it's already so big. That's the problem.
They couldn't shut it down.
They couldn't shut it down, right? So I remember one person telling me, Alex, in our company, it's actually very hard to get money for a project. But once we got it, it's hard to turn off the tab, right? So we continue doing things that work instead of creating more like an ecosystem where they can explore. So that's why these giants have a hard time to. Is there a law on that? So that was the original question.
Osterwalder's law.
There's a killing business model.
There is a solution around, but I just haven't seen enough example. But let's pull our heads together, right? Because there is a idea about modularity. And you apply inside a company that could be quite powerful, because what you described is that I need to be able to stitch together a business model and dismantle it at speed with scale. And I could only think about one theoretically is the modularity, that any capabilities or any way of working a small team is like microservices. And here we are Thinkers 50. We all heard about the higher story. I see a little bit about MasterCard, but I just haven't seen enough company who have gone down the long train of hard work, break up the monolith from tech stack to organization design to, institutionalize a new culture. But once you actually have that, theoretically, conceptually, you could actually adapt quite quickly because the sunk cost is lower. And also, you could build something relatively quick, and when it doesn't work, you could dismantle and rechannel elsewhere. Yeah. Any other example?
No, let me build on that, because that's actually a really good point. Modularity makes you structurally agile. So you're building capabilities, you can recombine them. There's a challenge with modularity as well, and that is that traditionally companies were defensible because they had high fixed costs, right? Yeah. But if you just build out all these building blocks and everybody else is building blocks, the barriers to entry go away.
Oh my!
Where's the new barrier to entry? So the way I see this happening, and I'll take the example that we both love so much, Shane, right? The barrier to entry is you need to be modular, but you need to integrate across the modules where you can compound your learning. Traditional vertical integration was based on the idea of minimize transaction costs and maximize your margin that you can capture from the customer. Today, that does not matter. Value chains are going modular, but still a new vertical integration that we see with companies like Shane and intelligent manufacturing companies like Tesla is make your capabilities modular, but identify which capabilities will help you create a learning engine through which you are able to create a proprietary learning engine across those capabilities. And over time, once you've captured the learning, then you can modularize and commoditize those capabilities if you want to. But if you don't create that learning engine,
a learning loop,
you become modular and commoditized. That's the challenge. And Shane is a very good example because, just to wrap this, traditional manufacturing used to work on the logic of market research. Let's get ideas from the market. Let's convert that into new design, new production.
Like H&M, right? For instance.
H&M. But again, the logic applies not just to fashion.
Correct.
Across the board.
Yeah.
It applies to material science. It applies to Moderna and how it came out of the vaccine. all of that is possible when you reimagine, going back to your point, your architecture as take a small piece of evidence, whether from the market or from the lab, convert it into a small batch production, take it to the market and do a small test. And you can do that only if you're modular, but then own the whole chain so that you're learning and you're capturing the intelligence for yourself.
That's really good. This is why I love this conversation, right? It's like there are so much discovery for me right now because what you suggest there is the traditional competitive advantage is over.
Yeah.
We're not talking about transient advantage here, neither.
No.
But when you build that feedback loop, then you could always run faster than any competition.
Absolutely.
And that's interesting because I could see fashion you describe in your book, John Deere, that they don't just make tractor, but each of these tractor becomes a little information gathering out there in the field. Across worldwide, Figma against Adobe in your book again. But is this idea you build in so many feedback loop so that you know much better at a global basis, what are the little tweak I could do to win, I call 1 inch ahead, right? In the end, you don't need to be perfect. Wow.
It's compound to your
Cool ideas.
I'll add something to the equation. So 100% with you, the continuous feedback loop to go faster, but within an existing business model. So what you need to add is investing in many ideas, of which many will fail.
Yes.
Right? So you can't iterate yourself to success. So what we have in venture capital, which works really well, is the fact that we invest small amounts of money in a lot of ideas and, 90% will die. And then we double down and invest in the 10%, the whole portfolio approach, right? So what's missing, in addition to those quick feedback loops, is also the idea failure, if we do it the right way, is actually going to let the best ideas emerge. So we start small, we invest small, and then we double down. And it comes back to, this is actually an interesting phenomenon. And that's why probably 95% of projects in AI don't work, is that in established companies, what gives you prestige? How many people you manage and how much money you manage, right? So we think, big company, we need big return, which is true. But the problem is now we make big investments upfront. Now, what happens if you give a bunch of engineers and a bunch of scientists a lot of money? They're going to spend it. So there's no feedback, there's no learning loop. So you invest the same amount of money in 100 teams or 200 teams, and you, after 3 months, kill the projects if they can't show you evidence that the customers actually care. So you create a very similar system to venture capital, but within your company.
Yeah.
And again, the small thing is the challenge because every large company started small. That's 150 years ago was a startup, and it started small before it became big. And in large companies, we want to cut corners, make a big investment, which works in exploit, but doesn't work in explore.
Right.
So that's the big challenge, is that small things become big, but in large companies, you don't like small. But every big idea starts small.
Yeah, so the best company may not be armed with the best idea, but they certainly let the worst idea fail fast.
Exactly.
There's one thing, it's again serendipity. I'm reading this book, Permission Denied it's called, because Chuck House, this guy, he was told by Packard, don't be working on this project. I don't want to see this project in the lab in a year. So he interpreted it purposely. He selectively heard what he heard. And he said, okay, so you want it in the field in a year. But what he was told specifically not to do it. And he did it behind closed doors. And he himself, he's an engineer, went out with his family on a tour, drove around to different types of customers, took out his front seat of his Volkswagen Beetle and put in this machine and showed it to customers. And the only way that project took off was because one of his colleagues had had a heart attack and wanted to see his heart monitor on a heart monitor. And his wife was a nurse. And his wife said, this would be a very valuable project. Now, I say all that to say, A, he was told by the leader of the company, the owner of the company, the founder of the company, who, and this is where I did the research, I looked at his book, and in his book, he said, give engineers the space to explore.
Yes.
And that is a contradiction or a paradox that you see time and time again. And I really wanted you guys to share your view of that because you work with CEOs. And I think sometimes they believe they're giving people permission. But if those permissions, you mentioned the fire phone, if they fail, and I use that term, you keep a receipt. You have a blemish in your career. Chuck House said this about himself. He said he did a second project after having that hero project. He himself said, we need to kill the project. And he lost all his management, all his budget, and all of a sudden he went from hero to zero and he had to build that again.
Yeah.
That is a problem. And that makes people like him give up. Now, he didn't, but they're very, very rare, and the corporate immune system doesn't let them flourish.
And that's because we still have that hero syndrome. It's that one person who needs to fight the system. Like, yeah, well, then you'll get one innovation every, 50 years. So why didn't Nestle come up with one Nespresso?
Right.
Because that's the hero system, right? So what we need is actually a real system that leadership supports so that many can explore. And if you fail, it's not going to blemish you. And you can love Amazon or hate Amazon, but when Jeff Bezos was CEO, he did say, invention, he called it invention, success in invention. Like the flip side, you cannot do new things without failure. And then he would say, which is kind of crazy, right? The bigger we get with Amazon, the bigger our failures need to get. Otherwise, we're not going to move the needle. Yeah. But what he didn't say, people get that one wrong, everything starts with small failures. Until they get to a big failure, there's often very many iterations, right? But you mentioned that, right? The Kyndryl Fire Phone team was not fired. They moved. They moved, and those engineers came up with Alexa after us.
But what is interesting is you could actually audit a company to what extent they could embrace that resilience or that thick skin. You just ask, how do you conduct your after-action review? Do you write it down? To what extent you will share? So in a microcosm, and people wrote about it, and you're looking at Booking.com, right? They do tons of experiment. And engineers need to log their experiment in a centralized system. And then no permission needs to ask. So a junior guy in Sydney can look up what's going on with a VP in Amsterdam. It's, right to know, not need to know basis. And so there are actually day-to-day habit we as external can help audit, and to what extent we are embracing radical transparency. Without transparency, there's no learning because knowledge doesn't flow around.
Yeah. And I'll just add one point too, because these are very interesting perspectives, going back to your point about architecture as well. And I think it's absolutely, you are absolutely spot on about the fact that there is no way to really get to the next breakthrough without that permission to fail and without letting so-called 1,000 flowers bloom. And what helps kind of as a company, what's important for you to then succeed with it, because you want things to succeed, but then how do they fit together? What's that picture? So you need to be very clear about what do we want to become? As the world is changing, what do we want to become in a year from now, 2 years from now? It's not a 1 year, 2 year plan. You can't plan when the structure is uncertain, but you need to have a vision of here's what we want to be. Here's the logic of how we'll operate 1, 2, 3 years from now, and constantly update that based on how things are changing. But then as these experiments succeed, see how they align towards that, because you're not just chasing financial returns. And this is the only mild deviation from venture capital, where the portfolio model itself is sufficient. Here, you don't want just a portfolio, you want architecturally cohesive returns. And so you need to have that vision, that architecture of capabilities, and then say, okay, that maps back here.
But can I just build on what you said at the end? Because I think that vision piece is missing a lot in established companies, right? So just ask yourself, how many CEOs can you now, count on your one hand probably that you can remember having a very clear vision of the future, right? So you mentioned MasterCard, which is a very beautiful example of having a very, very clear articulation of what that vision is, and they don't know exactly how to get there. That's the experimentation part, but the vision will not change.
And the vision is not a budget. I think a lot of time we've seen is that
it's a vision of the future.
We have a vision.
Yeah.
How much time do I need to tell you that we want to grow by X amount?
That is not.
That is not.
Yeah.
Inspiring.
And MasterCard said the former CEO kill cash. That's it.
And that's the vision, right? And then you operate within that.
And everything just falls throughout the organization. Now I'm in Africa, a small team working in Kenya. Oh, I need to kill cash. So I'm going to work with local telco company so that there will be mobile transaction happening. Yeah. I'm in Italy, Sicily. Again, kill cash. What does it mean? And I thought this is so interesting, right? Because it's hard work.
And try things, because not everything is going to work, right? So some ideas will grow into that. How are you going to make that vision? But from all those experiences, you have some that will succeed next.
No, I think this is really a really compelling example. The idea of kill cash, within it has the assumptions of where we play and how we win. It assumes that we're not playing in a cash economy, and the way to win is not to continue investing.
So cool.
Yeah. And I think, just a one line, really quick, interesting example happening right now is Shutterstock is having a Kodak moment today, right? Because just like, photos, you can generate photos, 100%. But Shutterstock has reimagined itself to say, we're going to be the place to guarantee good photo usage in a world of abundant photos. So artists will be compensated. We're going to do a partnership with OpenAI so that they can use our catalog, but then the artists will be compensated. And if you're an organization, you don't need photos, but you need consistent photo usage across the organization. We'll do that governance for you. We'll move it away from execution to governance. So it's, again, vision and then aligning everything in that direction.
And FYI, I love Shutterstock. It's like, you going into different platform, and this is like, all these are junk. And now I understand why.
Yeah. We're talking about competitive advantage before, and I think there's one thing that is very interesting to look at today is that you still get some competitive advantage from a very strong business model. So why is, we have Apple with iOS and we have Google with Android. They're just two. Why? Because their business models are literally invincible. But now, when you look at the most successful companies, you can actually see that they have a culture of experimentation. So just back to those who made it explicit, take Amazon, take Netflix. They made very clear how they invest in innovation. So they don't just use the words. They clearly show. Like take Amazon. We invest long-term and we invest short-term. Yeah. We're going to be world-class at managing warehouses, but we're also going to be world-class at exploring new things. So you could actually read. Now, I'm not a great investor, but I always look back at those things. The writing was on the wall. Netflix, same thing. So you can see which companies actually invest not in a technology. So not, Metaverse, AI. That's not the point. What they invest in is explicitly in the key aspects of an innovation culture within the company. And we can map those. You can see those. So then it doesn't matter if it's AI, if it's whatever, any technology. So the technology is never the challenge. It's the opportunity. The challenge is that the company hasn't built the ability to reinvent itself. So you can look at that. I mean, you could codify that. It would be actually great academic research. Can we codify an innovation culture? I believe so, because you read Jeff Bezos' investment letters. He's been saying exactly what he's been doing. Yeah. You could copy that. Yeah. It's just that very few companies have actually copied that innovation DNA.
And what Alex mentioned there is so important, because the exploration bit, they actually codify as explicit mechanism.
Yes.
As like organizational stuff you could see.
Yes.
The 6-pager before even ChatGPT coming along, people need to write a press release, work backwards.
Yeah. The one-way door, two-way return. Right.
So these are the artifact, you could say, is auditable. You're walking in, you ask, and what strikes me is whenever we have conversation with AWS and middle manager, they just roll it out from their tongue. So it's not some C-suite corporate talk. They live in day-to-day. That mechanism for explore, mechanism for exploit, and the handover between the two to scale and shut things down, every steps along the way, there's mechanism, codified processes getting us there.
There's a very important point in here that I really don't want our audience to miss, and especially if you're a leader. You mentioned about Bezos' letters, and through his letters, he's constantly communicating with shareholders. He's constantly communicating with his own teams. Yes. He's putting it out there for a very important reason. And to your point about vision, there's a concept in innovation called hunting zones, where it's where do we play? Where do we explore? So an example, NVIDIA, gaming or autonomous vehicles. So you're giving people a kind of a place to go, I can explore here, much like the war on cash type of idea. That doesn't matter about AI. That doesn't matter about digital. It doesn't matter about whatever your business does. It's actually something that's so controllable by leaders. And I'd love you to share a bit about this, because it's so absent in so many organizations. Like your point about in Amazon, they can roll it off the tongue. Yeah. But most organizations, as you go down the elevator in the organization, the message is diluted as you go down.
we work with one company that doesn't have hunting zones, but they actually did invest in some really great ideas, and they got them to a certain stage. Like they're experimenting. These are real businesses, but they're not breaking through. Why? Is because they do not have a clear vision of the future. So not the hunting ground per se, because they did that work. So the businesses could actually scale. But now there's no explicit vision of where the company is going. Like how is the world going to look like? How are we going to go there? And then there's no explicit protection of these ideas that made it to a certain level. So here's what's going to happen. If there is no protection of those ideas, they're going to die because the corporate antibodies are really strong. So in that case, because I do think we have different cases, in that case is really you have the idea, you have the evidence, everything is proven. But from here to turn that into a meaningful part of a multi-billion-dollar company is actually the willingness to now scale these ideas, to take that risk as leadership. And the challenge you have is that the CEO and the C-suite doesn't actually call the shots. It's the board and the investors. So there's a huge personal risk to leaders taking that last step. It's easy to do the portfolio part and the small bets and the failure, but then actually investing is the last piece. So, it's not possible everywhere. Amazon could invest in Amazon Web Services. Why? Because the ownership structure. Because the stock market said, you guys are crazy. Why are you doing IT infrastructure when you're an e-commerce company? So there is a thing there. And take Paul Polman, with the whole sustainability vision, he took a huge personal risk and he did something you could almost argue it's maybe illegal. He told shareholders, if you want to, invest with us, think long-term. What he forgot to mention is they're the owners. You can't tell the owners what to do. But so there's something there that I think in the conversation is that we talk about the C-suite as if they made the decisions. But when you do not have board members in the stock market that understands how a company has to transform, it's going to be very hard.
And they nearly have to face an existential crisis like Shutterstock in order to get that architectural shift inside an organization. You've got great examples of this.
No, I think, we're sort of kind of dancing around a really nice theory over here. There's corporate antibodies, which I really love. There's a second piece, which is architectural alignment and vision. And you need to balance that together. And I'll add a third thing over here, which I think, adds some flavor to what you're talking about. And that is that we have been brought up in a culture of getting to answers. We want to be certain of here's the answer. I've figured it out. We want to, give confident presentations. And the way to get to answers is you build really good sensing mechanisms, get all the information, get all the data. Let's create some nice reports which give the answers. Well, I believe we're moving to a world where answers are cheap. A simple manifestation is, answers used to be $400,000 to McKinsey, and now it's one prompt to ChatGPT. I'm not saying that they're perfect substitutes, but there's direction very close also. So maybe better, right? So let's
Deep research, pay for the premium, reserve it a month.
do not want to pick up fights with McKinsey, but the point is very clear that directionally we're heading in a direction where answers are cheaper. So what do you do when answers are cheaper? The value moves away from getting to answers to asking the right questions, because asking the wrong questions has opportunity cost of getting you down the wrong rabbit hole. The right questions have compounding benefits. 1 inch ahead compounded is really powerful. It's not just 5 inches anymore. And the way to get to that is to move from sensing to sense making. And that is, don't just look at data, create maps. It's the age of exploration. When Portuguese exploration started, they had not figured out Cape of Good Hope and, how we get to Asia and all of that. They constantly created better maps and kept on betting with better maps. That's what we need today. So we need to move from sensing to sense making at every level of the organization, because without that, we're just going to be caught in, give me better answers. Where's the data for this? Yes, we need data, but for sense making, not for getting to answers. So I think that's, that's the final part. And I'll throw into this theory that we have.
I mean, what Sangeet you just mentioned is, the most effective executive must have the ability to zoom in and zoom out.
And range.
And they cannot just take some reckless bet. And we have seen company take reckless bet. What happened is that in the name of courageous move, the C-suite actually do not know how to zoom in. the best leader is you're looking at all these iconic leaders from Procter & Gamble to Unilever, from NVIDIA to at the height of power of Intel, right? These leaders are not just curious. They don't just hang out at Davos or go to South by Southwest, but they actually are curious enough to zoom in and skip level, right? They're not going to put up BS from the direct report. They're going to go 3 level down, but not to just the existing operation, but dive into new venture as well.
Yeah.
And I think if C-suite outsource their thinking, why should they command such a nice package?
Yeah. The thing, what I like about what you're saying is that going back to managerial leadership and entrepreneurial leadership, what does an entrepreneur actually need to do on the path to success? Zoom in, zoom out all the time.
100%.
So you're from, I'm going to sign a contract with my first client to how is the world going to change? Which business model, is going to make money? So you are forced to zoom in and zoom out. Now, in most companies, I shouldn't generalize, but what I see very often with the clients we work with is you'll have world-class, exceptional leaders in a specific domain, marketing, operations, finance, but they're not used to zooming in and out of all the topics and how they connect. Because in an established business, in the exploit part, you don't have to always understand everything. This is a well-oiled machine. But as soon as you do something new, it's not going to be enough to just understand operations. Clients don't care. Okay, we might want to change that. You have to sign this contract with the government to be allowed to do that. So you have to navigate. And that entrepreneurial thinking and zooming in, zooming out, and then adapting constantly, that's not a skill that, it does exist in established companies, but it's not one we value very much. You say, that's an annoying person now. She's bringing up this and that. And, that is the skill that allows you to explore. And that exists in companies, but they don't have a place to explore.
They don't, and they often get thrown out like an antibody would crush a pathogen. One of the things that came to mind, and it was based on something that you said, Sangeet, about the idea of data, access to data from diverse sources. I thought about this, and excuse the analogy, I think in analogies and metaphors, I was reading recently about what the effects of psychotropic drugs do to the brain. So psilocybin, for example, is that the brain has been compartmentalized or balkanized. You mentioned that term earlier on. It's got these compartments for specialities. And what these drugs do is that they turn them off. So the brain starts to connect across and literally make connections that were broken in the past. And I thought about the data thing, but then I thought more importantly, and you were saying about how you've had some insights today, and this is the goal of this Innovation Show X, is to bring people who have expertise together to have discussions across those boundaries. But inside organizations, people exist within these silos for a very good reason. But now, because the architecture of the organization, to the point of Conway's law, needs to change, they need to be flowing into each other, sharing information, and not feel threatened by that. And that's a huge, huge issue. Again, to the point of this is a reshuffle, not of technology, but of structure.
Yeah, no, I think, so I love the analogy, irrespective of what people have issues with the exact topic, but we need psychotropic drugs for organizations.
It's in your brain.
We need,
everybody's finished.
That's why we are making connection right now here.
Refill everybody.
So we need that. And we need that because I believe that, a lot of the theories on which we are basing our ideas today were built in an era which was relatively stable. So modularity, exploit. When these theories were built out, that was an era of stable structure. You still thought of industries, you thought of markets. You did not think of continuous customer journeys and industry boundaries melting together. So the point is that all of that is still important, but you can't compartmentalize saying that's the team that does exploring and here's the team that does exploiting, because you're constantly going to have to manage both things all the time. It's not, yes, you want to explore and then you want to exploit, but you don't move to phases. You have to balance them constantly. You might be exploiting something while something else shows up on the horizon. So we're going to be living in cycles and not in stages. And if we're going to live in cycles, we have to really inject organizations with those psychotropic drugs. That's the only way to do that. Otherwise, you're just going to, look at balance sheets, you're going to look at teams, you're going to look at budgets, and you're going to say, okay, that's the explore part, and let them do that till we kill them. And here's some exploiting that's very good. Let's throw money over there. It's just a wrong way to think about uncertainty and change.
Yeah,
100%.
But you activate, this is back to the vision, back to the hunting zones, back to the shareholder letters. You activate the certain part of the brain, the reticular activating system, to actually go, these are important. These are places to look. These are places for hints for the future. And the exploiters of the organization are usually on the edges. And Andy Grove famously said, snow melts from the edges.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the changes first start to happen. And the exploration teams are usually in a lab somewhere or an R&D department where they have no access to the outside world. And it's that thing. And I know certain people are more exploration minded, maybe more curious. But when people are activated to go, this is actually important to the organization, then they can start to notice things.
But the way it actually works is you cannot have black and white. So what people sometimes confuse is they think explore lives somewhere, exploit lives somewhere else. So what I like to talk about is the dual mindset is that I'm a CEO. So guess what? I have a meeting with the sales team for a known product. Well, I'm in exploit mode. And then I have a meeting with my product team looking at something new. The same person, I need to ask completely different questions. So I'm in explore mode. So it's not that it lives there, it lives here. No, you flip between these all the time. And then you'll have people that, maybe in sales, they see some needs there and they become part of an explore team. So you have that fluidity that you're kind of referring to. That's true explore exploit. It's not left, right, black, white. It's that fluidity where we constantly explore. And we'll have people who are more comfortable with exploit. They'll rarely be part of an explore team, but they need to maybe enable an explore team.
Yeah.
So that fluidity is going to be incredibly important. And I do think some companies are better at it and some companies are not. And I think the worst ones are when you have, the explorer's over there. And then you have cynicism. You're going to go put up some sticky notes or play ping pong. And, I don't like the cynicism because there's something there that is actually true.
Yeah.
But it's because we don't fully understand yet. I'd say that often the leaders haven't fully embraced this, but once you tell them how this works, I see a lot of leaders who say, wow, I want to do that. Now, do they make the jump? There's a risk to it. That's another question.
And just in case some of the audience may feel like, but I work in a conservative industry or in a conservative region, GDPR wouldn't allow this. And I'm going to translate Alex's description into workable solution.
Yeah.
And everyone needs to play a part.
Yeah.
Now, the CEO must call out a vision. Now, if, the C-suite have no idea where we're going to moving in and just a budget, they're not doing their homework. But then at the team level, divisional level, the team lead must be the one who open up sandboxes. Okay, you're in healthcare life science, a lot of constraint, fine. Create sandboxes so that others, a junior guy, can combine your internal data, external market data, run an AI experiment within a safe sandbox, report back in 2 weeks. If that junior guy require 5 approval, 7 approval form, fix it. That's the team responsibility.
In PDF.
Right, in PDF as well. And then if you happen to be junior or individual contributor, when you see the sandbox open, volunteer. So what is beautiful about what Alex said is you could apply to life science in Europe in the most conservative country, and that's fine. Because what you're aiming for, again, is not perfection like NVIDIA, but 1 inch ahead, right?
Yeah.
And then you win.
Yes. Yes.
There's an important thing I wanted to bring up. Alex mentioned about it's very difficult to reorient the organization unless it's board level approved or it comes from the top. And I thought about Joe Bauer's work.
Yes.
So you studied under Joe Bauer. And and I always think of resource allocation process as it's like oil and water. There's a layer that doesn't mix. And that layer is often controlled by management down the organization. And for the point of Andy Grove, Andy Grove didn't decide the organization was beginning to become a semiconductor. The rules in the organization did. And the middle managed to decide where to put those resources. And I wondered where that played a role because it can hijack the strategy of the organization. That leadership think they're doing this, but management or people who actually control the resources are doing this.
Correct.
And that can be positive sometimes, like we saw with Intel, but sometimes it can actually hijack the organization in the wrong way.
100%. So I think this is why that Bergman extension at that autonomous activity is really important. Now, back then, you just need a few autonomous activity. That's fine because the world was slow. And what we're discussing here is like you need to turbocharge. And so you need to have mechanism going back earlier so that whether it's sandboxes, whether it's documentation, so that that autonomous activity could go much faster. And when something works, you can then scale through intermodularity within the organization or shut things down as quickly as possible. And that is, the contour is still right for sure, but the speed of change does demand an additional accelerant.
I'd add to that innovation is always bottom up, but you need the top-down systems building so that the innovation can actually happen. Yeah. So then I like to add to this mix when I'm working with some companies, I say, why is it dangerous when the CEO has an idea? What's the problem with the CEO's idea? And we've all seen this, right? Nobody tells the CEO their baby's ugly. So actually, innovation should not come from the top in terms, and when we're truly talking innovation, exploit is different. Yeah. But new breakthrough ideas don't come from the top. Now, what comes from the top is the vision. This is the direction where we're going, how we're going to do it. Like, what do customers care about? What are they willing to pay for? Leaders don't know if we're talking about the new world, because what they know is the past world. Yeah. So they'll make decisions based on the past world. So what we actually need to start to do is have this evidence-based investments that are bottom up, but within a strategic direction within a vision. So kind of, left, right, bottom up, and zooming in, zooming out.
That's right.
That's what we need to create, these organizations that are extremely, and I would say fluid more than agile, because agile has been high.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I mean, I'm really glad you bring that point up, because I think agile comes from a world of operational uncertainty, which means that the structure is fixed. We know what game we are playing. Yes. We just have to figure out how to play it better. Fluid is that we need to morph. And that's because the game has to constantly change. So you need to keep morphing. But the challenge with morphing is you need to ask yourself, morph towards what, right? And so increasingly, the biggest driver of shareholder returns, I believe, will be the ability to place a bet, take the risk against it, and say, this is what we morph towards. And that's not one bet. It's constantly changes. But the leaders, and I'm not just saying CEOs, the CEO pay is exponentially higher than the rest of the organization. But increasingly, I believe that we'll have to move towards new ways of managing organizations where we reward people who are able to place bets, stand by it, show results, and do that continuously, because continuous bets, 1 inch ahead, I keep coming back to this, 1 inch ahead has to be compounded. And the way to do that, or to have vision and structure and, take the risk again.
Also, I'll give you a challenge, because an example, because we're talking about AI at the end of the day, right? So I think a lot of these established companies are not aware how AI actually might disrupt them concretely. So if you're a skincare company today, you say, you have a lot of data. Well, probably you have data on consumer behavior and buying. Right. But like if we're talking AI, it's not going to be consumer behavior that we care about. We're going to care about hugely personalized skincare that is just for us. What does that mean? We need access to health data, not consumer buying data, because people today, they don't know how to buy skincare products that are good for them. Yeah. And the only way to decide is actually knowing, either through the mouth or further down, like what is the data?
Microbiome.
And I do not see any of the skincare companies today actually asking that question. Where are we going to get the data from?
Right.
So whoever has that data, whoever in skincare, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, whatever, whoever has that data is going to win. And companies do not realize sometimes how this whole, containerization is going to change the landscape radically. So their business model is already dead today, but they don't realize, right? So they're not.
Absolutely. So, I so love this example, because skincare is such an interesting example of, you can't just base it on preferences. It's also health, etc. On the other side, AI is having another interesting effect, which is that skincare is based on compounding. You have to figure out new chemicals, and AI can figure out chemicals better than humans can. Yeah. But AI cannot figure out which chemical map to which process, map to which end user need of personalization and health will work best.
And that go to market to pop up on the feed
Exactly.
at the right time with the button right there.
Right. And so the way to do that is to have that learning engine all the way from compounding to the...
There we go.
And to my knowledge, I don't see it else that is that.
I don't think so.
But great opportunity for startup.
There's an important thing that I didn't want to leave unsaid, which was you kind of got at this a little bit, Alex, earlier on. We mentioned Alexa and the Fire Phone. That really involves killing a project. And why I brought up Chuck House, this gentleman again, was he had a hit product with this screen. Then he had a second product. And he said, and he talked about the visceral feeling, the emotional decision. It was irrationally made total sense to kill the project. He couldn't see a future for it. He couldn't see it making paying any dividends within 2 years. But emotionally he said, my career depended on it. It meant that my dream of being a manager was gone. It meant letting go of these resources. It meant actually blemish on my career. And that killing the project is not, even though he had the bravery to say it to the organization, he still got punished for that. This is a huge thing. And I know it's something you've talked about.
It's big, right? Because so when I give a talk at a conference, I always ask, how many of you are working on a project you know should be killed? And at least a third of the room, hands go up. Then another third probably are just, they're doing
Their boss is there.
And then one third might actually be working on some success. So then I ask, well, why are you guys still working on that? Are you stupid? And they, of course, just, no. And everybody knows it's the process and the system that doesn't make it possible to kill, or doesn't make it easy to kill projects. So the kill rate should increase. And what happens often is that the decision was made to do this. And then the team learns, they actually have the learning engine. It's not even that the learning engine is missing. They know we should kill this thing. It's doomed. But there's a disconnect between the team that just learned and who's allowed to make the decision. And then the whole cultural aspect that you're bringing in, the shame of. So that's why we continue to invest in projects that should be killed. People know. It's not that they don't know. That's the crazy part, right? So we need to build a better system where it's okay to kill projects. So I talk about this, and we were mentioning the resource allocation thing.
Yeah.
We need better resource allocation today to be able to kill the project that should be killed, because we know it's not rocket science, right? We often know, can be better at the metrics, and then we invest in those that have the potential. So the resource allocation today in companies is still pretty broken, right? We all know those budgeting processes, they do not work. So there's a huge thing there that, we need to address as well if we want these fluid organizations. Because at the end of the day, what do people, work on? It's where the money goes, right? The budget's for the people, etc. So, and we need to change that. It's very clear.
Closing thoughts, gents, closing thoughts. So bring it back to where we started, which was AI, the impact on business model, reshuffling the entire architecture of the organization. Closing thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I'll just bring together my summary of, what we've discussed, right? That's great. I end my book with this line: you don't need an AI strategy, you need a strategy for the world that AI creates. And I think that's what we are fundamentally talking about over here. And that is, going back to your point, where to play, how to win, both those things are constantly changing. In order to work towards that, what we are also saying over here is it's not enough to be agile. In fact, many of the practices that we learned in what we call agile will actually hold us back and prevent us from thinking about how to be liquid, how to be fluid, how to morph to what we need to become next. And in order to really create a good home for innovation, I think also what we are saying is you need to let 1,000 flowers bloom, but that's not enough. A culture of failure management is not enough. You also need vision, structure, architecture, and ensure that there's a way to map that back to, all your experiments back to that, and to create that culture that enables, but when I say culture, I also mean incentives that enable that to happen. So I think, that to me is, what I capture from what we've just talked about.
Beautiful. Howard?
And what we describe here, of course, are the key principle that organization will prosper in that future AI world. Now, the listener may be like, oh my God, my company is so backwards. It's like, oh my God, I get stuck. I don't have the decision power. But in the end, we don't need to shoot for perfection. It's like you don't need to figure out 2030, the 10 capability critical. It really boils down to, in your local environment, maybe it's in Brussels, meeting this B2B client tomorrow. What kind of one thing you could do to start doing it differently that would allow you to build up that new skills so that you can perform and transform today? Again, nobody needs to become like NVIDIA. You just need to, again, 1 inch ahead of your local competition, meeting the same client so that your skill would, cutting across. And that little win allows you to compound the success. You would feel the joy of success, and that would snowball.
And Alex?
For me, it's all about back to business basics. So we get blinded by technology, Metaverse, AI, whatever. At the end of the day, it's a means to an end. And the business rules haven't actually changed ever. It's like, we need to create value for customers and we need to create value for our business. Otherwise, we're done. And then ideally, we start to add, like, how are we creating value for society? But just get the business basics right and understand how your organization should be set up to explore how we create value for customers, for our business, for society. Then you can deal with any technology, right? So now AI is indeed a very powerful technology, but if you don't get those business basics right, you're not going to get it right. So don't invest in the technology, invest in your organizational structure and capability first to explore things that can work with you.
Absolutely. So where can people find you, gents? Alex?
Strategizer.com.
Strategizer with a Z, right? Strategizer.com. Howard?
1 inch ahead, Substack.
And Sangeet?
Platforms, the plural word platforms.substack.com.
Because the singular brings you to Substack's platform. Yeah. And it's been an absolute pleasure having these gents. We have to get off to a black tie dinner. I need to shave my legs, and the gents here have to get their tuxedos on. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining us on the Innovation Show. Sangeet, Paul Choudary, Howard Yu, Alex Osterwalder, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Great pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks always to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses with a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability. Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com.